Welcome to the Mailtime Podcast. I'm joined today by Jonathan Schanzer, the indefatigable leader, one of the leaders of FDD. Thanks so much for taking the time, Jonathan.
Pleasure. Good to see you.
The last time I had you on, I think the next day, as I was editing, there commenced the 12-day war. So I guess we're just going to have to run right after we finish recording and put this online so as everything doesn't go to waste. But before we get into Iran, as a expert on the Middle East region, what are your thoughts looking back at the fact that now Israel was able to successfully return all 250 plus hostages? Did you think it was possible on October 7th? And how do we kind of stack that up in terms of regional achievements in the last, say, 100 years?
I mean, look, I thought it was not possible. In my head, I wrote off every one of those hostages as dead. And I think, by the way, that is probably the way a lot of people quietly thought about it in the IDF. I think they had to, because they had a war to fight, right? And it was, it was an existential war, right? A 7-front war, multiple proxies, multiple enemies, all with capabilities that could have done a lot more harm to Israel than they ultimately did. But the Israelis had to look at it as a fight that they needed to finish in lots of other places, and that the hostages were probably among the lower priorities. Now, if you ask me what changed, what actually enabled the return of those hostages, this is where I point to the September strikes on the Hamas apartment building in Doha. That was the thing, if you ask me, that was the thing that tipped the balance. That's what motivated the Qataris to finally get up off their keisters and actually negotiate an end to this crisis. I believe that the Qataris were dragging this out. I believe it was psychological warfare that was being waged against the Israelis. I cannot believe for a second that anybody thought that the Qataris were serious about trying to get those hostages out. But the moment that they realized that they had become the 8th front in this war, that was the moment that I believe they decided that this was too much.
Do you distinguish between Hamas and Qatar?
Not really, no. I mean, the thing is that, Qatar is one of the primary patrons of Hamas, right? The Qataris, the Turks, and the Iranians are the 3 key patrons of Hamas. The Qataris never stopped being a patron for Hamas, even after the slaughter, after the kidnappings, after the war had erupted across the entire region. It's not like the Qataris said, okay, wait a minute, you know what? This is a bridge too far. Guys, we're not going to do this anymore. We're cutting you off. If anything, they started to act as the protectors of Hamas. They were looking out for the interests of Hamas as these negotiations dragged on. And the minute that the Israelis said that's enough, and they hit them, and they showed them that they were vulnerable, and that, by the way, it didn't matter whether the United States was based in, the Al Udeid Combined Air Operations Center, didn't matter. The Israelis were still willing to strike, and whatever they fired was not something that showed up on the American radar. Right? From what I could tell anyway, this was some kind of a weapon that eluded the sensors, eluded the air defenses. And that was, I think, the moment where the Qataris said, okay, that's it. I'm saying uncle, and I'm getting out of this game. Now, they are still negotiating on behalf of Hamas in some way. I don't like that they're in the Board of Peace. I think they're the fox in the hen house. The idea that we're going to try to create a more peaceful Gaza with the patrons of Hamas inside the tent, that seems insane to me. But look, bottom line, when you look at the way that they got the hostages out, and I will give, by the way, full credit to Ron Dermer and Bibi Netanyahu. And I'm not saying that they're great on everything, and I know people have their disagreements, but what these guys decided that they were going to do on day one of the war was to win the war. They wanted to make sure that they actually took the war to Iran and all the proxies. They did that, and they got the last of the hostages out. This is like a John Grisham ending. And I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was neat at the end, right? Like, I would have liked to have seen more live hostages come out. We lost lives along the way. That was terrible. But at the end, getting even all the bodies out and the 20 remaining live hostages, I mean, unbelievable, unthinkable. And they did it. And I actually am going to give a lot of credit to Dermer. But I also give credit to Netanyahu, who's under enormous pressure from the hostage families. And we can talk about the hostage families. I will just say, I feel nothing but sympathy for them. The ordeal that they went through was just harrowing. But I also think that they deprived the Israeli government of a certain amount of leverage by platforming this issue so publicly and having it so dominate Israeli culture and society for 2 years plus. It's the exact opposite of what people recommend when there are hostages, right? When ISIS would take American hostages, the kidnap and ransom experts would say take down all mention of the hostage from the internet. No mention, no pictures, no videos, nothing. Make them look less valuable, right? And that's the recommended way of getting them back. The Israeli society, led by the hostage families, did the exact opposite. They plastered the faces and names and videos and stories of every one of the hostages that were taken and made them appear more valuable. And somehow Bibi had to overcome that in order to get them back. And the way that he did it was by attacking Qatar.
So I have two follow-up questions to you based on that response. One is, I just have to say, it wasn't every single face and it wasn't every single story.
Correct.
It was a particular narrative. So that has to be pointed out. This doesn't mean that when you're having a discussion with someone who's very much involved in the leadership or very much supports the hostage forum, that you disagree with everything they ever said or ever did. But it is important to say that there is a certain center, left of center perspective that was pushed by the forum. And that's why you had some faces that were very prominent and others that were less so.
By the
also
way,
for other reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'll just say, I'm not saying that I don't sympathize. I'm not saying that I don't understand. I understand, right? I mean, this was incredibly painful to Israel as a society and to the hostage families themselves. I get why they did it. But what I am saying is it did make it lessened the Israeli leverage, and it made it more challenging amidst a very challenging environment already. It muddied the waters further for the Israeli leadership as they tried to prioritize. Nobody trusted this government from within the hostage forum. They ascribed to this government the worst of intentions, and eroded the government's leverage to figure out where it wanted to prioritize the release of the hostages. It was being demanded from outside.
I also think that it's very challenging when you have members of the hostage family members saying things extremely incendiary about the leadership of Israel to foreign officials. And I witnessed that firsthand on a number of occasions. So to me, that's where there's a certain line. And again, I'm very sympathetic and friendly and supportive. And there's many people that are in that group that I consider, blood brothers now. But that's a different, that's an intellectual discussion, which I think also has to be had. But, you invoked experts and the historical literature on hostage negotiation. Perhaps the historical literature was incorrect. Perhaps it was wrong. I mean, if you look at the Golden family having to deal with this ordeal with Hadar for over a decade, I don't think that Leah Golden, Hadar's mother, was happy with how the government was handling it before. So how do we reconcile that perhaps some of the expert literature was incorrect and the lessons that were learned from this experience?
It's an interesting question, and I think, I mean, let me just say, I'm not a KNR expert, right? I don't do kidnap and ransom. That's not my thing. I know what, I've worked on some cases where, we tried to get, Steven Sotloff released by, ISIS. And that ended horribly. It was a tragedy, and the family, will never be the same. And they listened to what the KNR experts said, and it still worked out poorly. The conceptia, if you will, among those that are experts in this space is that that's the way to do it. Maybe that's changed. I mean, maybe, by the way, I mean, when you look at group kidnappings of, this magnitude, um, maybe it's not the right way. What I am saying, though, is that when you look back at what Israel was able to achieve, the victory on all 7 fronts, and by the way, no victory is permanent. And I would say that, yes, like right now, Israel has the edge, and it's remarkable, but it doesn't mean that they can't begin to lose again. The battle's not over. The war is still raging. Even if right now it feels like it's on a low flame, it could tomorrow heat up with an attack on Iran or what have you, right? And that could change the dynamic, right? All the unintended consequences of war. But what is so interesting to me is that the hostages, or rather the hostage families, had an enormous influence on the government and its decision making throughout this process. It was in some ways undermining the IDF, undermining the Israeli decision making structures, Mossad, Prime Minister, Shin Bet, IDF. They're all working to win a war. And what they are getting, instead of just victory, right, which is usually what people are advocating for, it's victory and. It's victory and the impossible, right? Or what was thought to be impossible. And, they were still working to get them out. And there were different phases where they were either, with special operations, bringing out either live hostages or bodies. They're negotiating and trying to win a war all at the same time. And in the end, somehow, and this is, I think it's the remarkable outcome. It's a miracle in some ways, right? They come away with the upper hand on all 7 fronts and get all the hostages out. Did not see that. Not on my bingo card. Not something I would have ever predicted on October 8th, 2023.
And you mentioned the word victory, and my discussions with a number of the hostage families who have had bad results, right? Living hostages that went in and they came out in body bags. And there's a aversion to that word. And I myself am still trying to figure out exactly how to think about it, especially because you think about the cost on Israel as a society, and also the fact that Hamas is still there in Gaza. And that's something that's going to have to be dealt with. And I guess time will tell on that. And we're going to have to, we could speak for hours and hours and hours about how we actually define how victory is defined. Yeah.
If I can, I think, the idea of defeating Hamas when it will not surrender, and we know that it won't, it's a challenge. And when you think about the enemy, the nature of the enemy, the ideology of that enemy, and you look now at Hamas's inability to mount any serious attack against Israel, missiles or rockets rather, are effectively down to 0. They're bringing in like revolvers and rifles by drone because they don't have enough to fight, right? The Israelis are making a big deal that they found a bunch of mortars, right? We're not seeing the same kind of threat that's being posed. And on top of that, Hamas now only controls 47% of the Gaza Strip as opposed to 100. So the territory that it controls has now been reduced by half. Its military strength has been reduced by 85%, 90%. Its fighting force has been ground down. I see, look, all things equal, it's a victory. Is it like absolute victory?
Or total victory, to quote from the prime minister, right?
Yeah, nitzachon muchlat, it's not, right? But it is a victory. And now it's going to be up to Israel to figure out how to steer this into a way where you can lock in that victory long term.
How do you reconcile the fact that you have, obviously Qatar's involvement going forward, and there seems to be a very close relationship with Qatar and the Trump administration? How do you reconcile that with the temporary victory, I guess we could say, that's going on in the Gaza Strip and in the surrounding areas? How do you ensure that that doesn't that it becomes permanent as much as it can be and is not undermined by malignant actors, domestic and foreign?
Um, it's a good question, and I mean, I got to say, I think that Qatar being involved in the Board of Peace, it does not resonate with me as a sound idea. Both Qatar and Turkey, right? Full on patrons of Hamas. They've been hosting Hamas leaders, rolling out the red carpet, giving them full diplomatic treatment since the war. Both countries have a significant leadership presence in their country, right? Hamas leaders that are there, that are issuing statements on behalf of the terror group in Gaza, handling money. In some cases, there are operatives that have been based in these countries that have blood on their hands. Um, this is unacceptable to me, that they would still be considered American allies or trusted Western partners. And of course, Turkey is a NATO ally. And the Qataris are major non-NATO allies of the United States and major investors in the country. This is unacceptable. And if you ask me, there's a big question that, and FDD will be putting out a report on this. We need to re-examine the alliance structure that we have in the Middle East when this is all said and done. Um, you know, we had, I mean, it's not just the Qataris and the Turks, by the way. I mean, I look at the country of Oman. Oman it's crazy, but this is a country that has a Houthi headquarters, right? So, and we consider them to be American allies. It's a huge problem here, right? We need to start to make new demands of our allies. You want to be part of the American alliance structure. You want to be part of, some Middle East NATO or whatever we're calling it, right? You got to play by certain rules, and you've broken those rules. So the idea that these two countries in particular have been included in the Board of Peace troubles me. I understand why they're there. The Trump administration believes that they will do less harm if they're inside the tent. But I got to say, if you are asking me whether it's a good idea for them to have a stake in Gaza with Hamas still active there, I think they're still advocating and agitating for a resurgent Hamas, and that is unacceptable to me.
I want to turn to Iran for the last little bit here. There's a lot of start and stop. Are we going to attack as Americans? Are we not? Is Israel going to attack? What's going on? Which official is in America today? Which official traveled to Israel? It's a lot to keep track of. As the expert in DC, what should people know about what's going on?
We are as close to a very large regional war as I can recall. The Middle East is on the precipice of something that could be enormous and very, very destructive. I think that's probably the simplest way to sum it up.
Destructive in a bad sense, or destructive in, hey, the regime could be overthrown?
Well, I mean, if you know how to predict wars, then you know how to answer that question. Wars are filled with unintended consequences. That is just the nature of war, right? I mean, Hamas attacks Israel thinking that, Israel is going to be destroyed. Look what happened, right? It did not redound to the benefit of Hamas. And Yahya Sinwar, I think, is rolling over in his grave right now as he looks around at the Iranian axis. You can launch a war with intent, but it may not come out the way that you intended. And so right now, the U.S. is mulling a strike, possibly a decapitation strike that would, take out the top leaders in Iran, and pave the way for regime change. There are a lot of people who are wary of regime change. It's a dirty term in Washington. We've paid the price by trying to engineer regime change in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. What's interesting to me, and I feel like nobody ever talks about this, but ask yourself why we failed at regime change. We failed because the Iranians were launching insurgencies and funding them and arming them against us. The Iranians were in Afghanistan. The Iranians were in Iraq, and they were doing everything they could to undermine the United States and our ability to engineer that change. And so, if anything, I'm sort of, struck by the fact that Iran continues to be the problem around the region. To me, the question now is the details of this plan that Trump is apparently mulling for operations against the Islamic Republic. Is it well thought through? Have they, have they kind of dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's? And are we ready for a war that actually, takes care of this problem once and for all? Or is the plan maybe not as thought out, and does it unleash hell in the region? I think one of the things that I'm watching probably more closely than others right now is I don't think it's a question of what we attack inside Iran. I think those targets are probably pretty static at this point. IRGC, besiege, supreme leaders' assets. Right? Maybe some oil facilities. I think those things are all pretty much preordained. The question for me is air defense, because I think that we saw what happened with Israel and the damage that it sustained during the June war of last year, the 12-day war, right? Some missiles came in, did some real damage to Israel. Thankfully, not a lot of casualties, but still, you could see it was scary. And I was there for the first half of that war, and I got to tell you, I've never seen Israel so immobilized. But Israel's not alone here, right? We're talking about air defenses for all of our regional partners. They're all nervous right now. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, they all want to make sure that they've got that layer of defense where the United States is going to be shooting down these missiles. And then there's U.S. servicemen that are based all over the region that are also said to be potentially under attack. I think we also have some concerns about sleeper cells possibly here in the United States. We know the Iranians have contracted bad actors in the past to try to carry out attacks, including against the president for that matter. So, I think there are a lot of questions that I have just about, are we insulated against Iranian action? And I guess these are questions that will likely be answered. But in the meantime, as you probably are well aware, there are talks that are going to be held apparently in the next couple of days. Iranians sitting down with the United States, having a conversation about essentially capitulation on the part of the Islamic Republic. They're going to have it. They're going to have these conversations in Turkey. If they go well, according to Trump, the Iranians will relinquish their nuclear program, never to use it again.
Isn't that what Obama promised?
Yeah. This is, there are a lot of people that are saying that this is, like the return of the JCPOA. Of course, we haven't seen what a deal looks like yet. But I got to tell you something. If the result is that we have no more nukes, but you have a massive ballistic missile program and you still have proxies all around the region, it's a Pyrrhic victory. And I think that's probably how the Israelis are looking at it right now. But in the meantime, there's some other interesting dynamics at play, including the protests that have thoroughly destabilized the regime. There's financial challenges that they're, it's like 1.5 million rial to the dollar right now. Purchasing power is down to like zero. There's the Islamic Republic is under a lot of strain. I was at a conference recently where the kind of herd thinking was that this regime can't last. And if that's the case, then, why negotiate? Why not just keep pushing the regime towards collapse?
Do you think that the decision has already been made and this is a lot of posturing, one way or the other?
Well, that would be asking me if I know how to read Donald Trump, and the answer there is no.
Understood.
I have no idea what this man is intending to do. I tend to
think he wants it that way.
Yeah, he does. I mean, the unpredictability of Trump is his greatest weapon against his adversaries. It also, by the way, can undermine his friends. And that's part of what frustrates me is I don't know how to explain what's going on even to our allies in some cases. But I will say that right now I see this overall maneuver of putting a massive armada in the Persian Gulf, snarling at the Iranians, making demands, forcing them to come to the table. I see all this as positive. Whether it stays positive really all depends on, whatever Donald Trump has cooking. If it's a deal, I hope it's a comprehensive one. If it's not a deal and it ends up being a strike, I hope it's a well thought out one that, leaves no room for doubt about the trajectory of this regime. I want to see it gone. Um, Either way, I think we want to see maximum U.S. leverage and the best possible outcome as it relates to the downfall of the Islamic Republic.
Last question before I let you go, and I don't want to open up a complete can of worms, but as we're talking, this kind of popped into my head. Social media is not real life. People like Cenk Uygur and Tucker Carlson screaming into the ether about different issues involving Jews and Israel is not actually real life. Thank God. As a Jewish expert who lives in DC, who is American and is dealing with Middle East issues, have you felt any impact from this kind of rhetoric and this kind of accusations of dual loyalty against Jewish people when you're going and meeting with people on the Hill or when you're having discussions? Have you felt that undercurrent at all?
I don't feel it day to day at all. I mean, look, where I feel it most is just seeing, some of the symbols of hate out there in the community. Some of the cultural trends that we see, and it's not just on social media, it's just general media. I will say that the comments directed toward me on social media have been eye opening, to put it mildly.
It's like every time at least for me, every time I try to have a thoughtful discussion with any of these agitators or similar people on X or elsewhere, the response from someone in there is, "Oh, you're Jewish." Which is
Yeah,
just
well, it's not
yeah,
just that. I mean, for me,
right.
it's
It gets
like,
worse, right?
it's like,
Yeah,
I hope you die. We're
right,
coming after you and all of you people. Like those sorts of things. Which
right.
I gotta say, I don't love. And it does make me nervous that this is, that this can happen in the United States. There's a certain amount of normalizing of this. But look, I would argue that right now it's not just, the war in the Middle East that's waging. There's a battle for ideas, battle for hearts and minds right now that's taking place in the United States. Um, I don't I don't consider myself to be on the front line of that, but I am keenly aware of it. I can feel it happening everywhere. I will tell you this. I've come to start wearing. I have all kinds of watermelon gear that I now wear. Um, I I don't like this idea of some of these symbols that have been adopted by by the Palestinian side of this. I think we can have a one fruit solution. I think it just drives me crazy that people sort of are wearing some of this stuff out on their sleeve, that it's become normalized. And so I'm trying to, I make my own little private statement of saying that you don't get to own this.
Right.
Um,
The Jewish people can eat watermelon too.
Yeah, I mean, watermelon in Israel is really good.
Right. Exactly.
Watermelon, salty cheese, and a Gold Star beer. Nothing better, than that on an afternoon on the beach in Tel Aviv. And so I think that I mean, I don't want to say we've allowed it, but the pitch of this debate, the discussion surrounding it, have they've gotten to the point where it has me worried and has me thinking about the future of the Jewish people in the United States. I'm definitely thinking about it, but day to day, for what I do, not so much. And again, if you remove social media, barely at all.
That's that's very, very encouraging, and I think I should be relieving for a lot of people who consume a lot of this stuff online. You'd think, based on how things are discussed, that it would be a lot more prevalent, and it's very encouraging to hear that it's not. So thank you. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go rush and edit this because if Iran and the United States engage now, this would be it would be a backdated discussion. So
Get
I
ahead of the
appreciate you taking
curve,
the time.
man.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, pleasure.